Did you know that leaders really do eat last? This and other lessons from a Cobra helicopter pilot in the U.S. Marines. This is the Philip Gagnon Show.
This is the number one podcast for real estate brokers and leaders. You're listening to the Philip Gagnon Show.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Philip Gagnon Show. I am your host, Philip Gagnon. With us today is Aaron Black, who is the Senior Consultant for Strategy and Business Ops. How are you, Aaron?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Philip?
I'm good, thank you. So you work with a company that does consulting for mental health facilities, is that right?
Yes, not just the mental health facilities, it's anything that's in the behavioral healthcare space. So that would include addiction services, things like that, not just the mental health and behavioral services.
Okay, very interesting. So tell us a little about what you guys do there, what you do there, your role specifically, and how you got there.
So Insight Consulting is a small, like you said, it's a small consulting company, primarily focused on the behavioral healthcare world. My role is that I provide the strategic planning component. So what we find is a lot of companies have difficulty taking an idea and turning it into a plan to get a result. As I think we'll talk about later, I was in the Marine Corps for 21 and a half years. And when my sister and I were having a discussion about a year ago, she was saying that she really wanted someone in the company who could help turn ideas into action, who could help her and the other organizations that she works with develop a strategic plan and then come up with a way to follow that through to completion. And I said to her, hey, you know what? I know someone who does that. Turns out that someone was me. And we decided that we'd go ahead and give it a try because although we come from different backgrounds, we share the same vision for people and specifically for our company, which is that individuals and families impacted by behavioral health conditions receive the whole person care that they need. So while we come at it from two different perspectives, we do have the same goal.
So these facilities are all obviously service based, right? They're not making products or widgets or whatever.
Correct.
Which is similar to the real estate space. What is the ownership structure of these companies? I mean, is it just one person that owns a facility, or are they multiple like shareholders? What does that look like?
So most of them are run by a board. They all have CEO, but that CEO often answers to a board. If that's a one building facility with a CEO that has 100 people, or a company that spans multiple counties in a state that's still a CEO that has 1,000 people that he or she is responsible for. They all have boards that help to run these organizations because a lot of the money that comes to them for their running of their operations, they come from mental health boards, they come from federal grants, they come from a lot of public funding. Now, some of the best examples are ones that incorporate private as well as public funding, and it depends really on where you are, what state you're in, how well integrated those facilities are into their communities. Depends heavily on where that funding will come from, but a lot of the funding comes from the federal or state governments. So that's one of the reasons that they have a board.
So you said you've been doing this for about a year, is that right?
Yep, a little bit over a year. I started last January.
And how are you enjoying it so far?
Oh, I love it. It's really been a lot of fun. I think I bring a different component to the organization, particularly from my military perspective. I really enjoy the leadership coaching piece of what we're doing, or what I have been doing. I think that's something a little bit new and something that we're developing as part of our overall strategic plan for our own company. But I've found that piece to be very rewarding because leadership is something that I've been doing for a very long time now.
So as you mentioned, you were in the Marines for 21 years, and
Yep.
you were a pilot for the Marines?
Yes, that is correct. A little bit, 21 and a half years. I don't know the exact number of days. I probably should. But I did have a countdown
do you count
timer.
Days after 20 years? Yeah, you got days to get out, right?
Right. At one point, I did have a countdown timer, a countdown to retirement. But yeah.
So what did you fly?
So I flew the Cobra, which is an attack helicopter, and I flew the C-12, which is known in the civilian world as a King Air 350. It's a VIP transport plane. It's a twin engine transport plane. So I flew all over the world with it.
So that part of it sounds like a relatively sort of a cush job that I think people would try and get after. Is that accurate?
It is. It was a lot of hard work, but it was a great job. There were a lot of benefits with having it, a lot of responsibility as well. I mean, anything that has a lot of benefits carries also a lot of responsibility. But yes, I was very
Sure.
fortunate because not many people got to fly the King Air.
And then before that, you flew the Cobra attack helicopter.
I did, yes.
So tell us about that. Because those things are so mean looking and they look like so much fun.
They are. They're a lot of fun to fly. So I had always wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. Um, and for as long as I could remember, I wanted to be a pilot. My dad was a pilot in the Marine Corps as well. And I kind of grew up around it, and it just was what I wanted to do. Interestingly enough, I didn't know that the first female pilot in the Marine Corps didn't come into the Marine Corps until 1997 is when she became a pilot, and which was the year I graduated from college. So I did not know that at the time because no one told me I couldn't fly. Um,
Hmm.
so there weren't very many women. I was a communications officer first for the first 4 years, and then I did transition to aviation. So by the time I got to aviation in 2001, it was still fairly new to have women in aviation. For most of my career, I was either the only one or one of the only female pilots in my unit. But the Cobra is an awesome aircraft. It's incredibly powerful. It has a number of weapon systems. It can be very complicated to fly. It's you have two pilots that fly. One person sits in the front and one person sits in the back. And who does what really depends on what your mission is and the experience level of the pilots.
So are you both trained as pilots, or is like one of them like a gunner navigator, or?
No, the Cobra is unique to a lot of multi-seat aircraft in that both people are pilots.
So you've got two sort of chefs in the kitchen. How does that work?
So there is one person that signs for the aircraft, and that person is called the pilot in command. So if you are the pilot in command, you own that aircraft. It does not matter if the other person is senior to you. It does not matter if the other person has more experience in the aircraft than you. The person that signs for the aircraft is the person who makes the decisions. Now, obviously, if you're with someone who has more experience, then you're going to ask their opinion. And if you were smart, you would probably
Sure.
take it. But at the end of the day, the person that signs for the airplane, much like the person who is in charge of something, they have responsibility for that aircraft and the crew.
So it's kind of like the rental car on a business trip. Whoever puts their credit card down is the one that's kind of responsible for it.
Exactly.
Same kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
So how does that get determined, especially if you've got somebody with more seniority? How does it get determined that you're going to be the signer, you're going to be the one responsible?
So it depends a lot on if it's a training mission or an actual combat mission. For the most part, on the combat missions, it's going to be the person who's more experienced. I mean, that just because then you're doing the job.
Sure.
On training missions, you'll often have people with less experience sign for the aircraft because they need to get the experience somehow. So it
Right. Yeah.
makes sense to put them with somebody who has a little bit more experience. So that they can continue to learn. And there are times when, the signer is a new signer, but you put them with a less experienced person because they need to feel the pressure of command, so to speak. They need to understand what it feels like to really be no kidding in charge. And there's a huge weight of responsibility with that. You literally have someone else's life in your hands. And if you're flying a mission where you're delivering ordnance, not only do you have the life of your co-pilot in your hands, you have the life of everyone on the ground in your hands. So it becomes very, very real, very, very quick.
When you say delivering ordnance, do you mean shooting stuff?
Yes. Sorry.
To put it in layman's
Sorry.
terms.
Yes.
No, it's
in
okay.
non-military speak, the things that go boom.
We're going to shoot stuff. All
we're
right.
going to shoot stuff. Big stuff usually.
Right.
So you got to know what you're doing.
Sure. So can you tell us the first time that you signed for the helicopter? What was that like?
It was pretty awesome. It's such a different thing when you're with someone else and you kind of know you have a responsibility, but they're more experienced. But when you do it for the first time yourself, it's an amazing feeling. And it really is empowering, and it's overwhelming, and it's exciting. It's very exciting. And it really is a huge confidence builder. And honestly, when it comes to leadership, I think that's a huge lesson, is that you have to let people be in charge. Maybe it's just something small. But the only way you're going to get your people to do better, the only way you're going to get them to grow is to give them the chance to do it. it's up to you to train them well, and it's up to you to make sure they've met the standard, whatever that standard is, and in whatever business or realm that you operate in. But once you've done that, you have to let them go do it, because that is the only way that they will grow.
And I'm assuming you guys trained a lot on simulators and that kind of stuff, and
We
I
did.
can't imagine it's exactly the same as being in a helicopter, but pretty close.
It is actually, the simulators these days are very, very good. When I first started, some of them were still pretty rudimentary, and we would have some that were essentially procedures trainers, so they didn't actually move. You would sit in it, and there were you'd have to go through the procedures of a certain operation. You'd have to go through the procedures of arming a certain type of weapon, or
Mhm.
de-arming a certain type of weapon, something like that. You would have to make sure that you could do that very, very quickly, and you didn't need the simulator to move. You just needed it to have simulate a cockpit. There were many simulators that did move, and those were very, very realistic in a lot of cases, and they've only gotten better over time.
So one of the things that I always find interesting in these types of situations is the decision making process.
Hmm.
When you look at if you look at business, as a leader in a business, you've got to make hundreds of decisions throughout the day. And when you're in combat, I would imagine, I've never done it, but I would imagine you've also got to make hundreds of decisions throughout a mission or whatever.
Hmm.
But there's a lot more on the line, and the impact, either positive or negative, is going to be a lot more immediate.
Hmm.
So tell me a little bit about that. What is that process like? How do you not get tired making decisions and continue to make good decisions? What does that feel like? What does that look like?
So the first thing that comes to mind is preparation, and you have to be prepared. And we have a thing called CRM, Crew Resource Management, and there are 6 skills. There's an acronym we use called DAM class to help you remember that. But essentially, what
So
it
what?
is
So tell me what. So what does DAM class stand for?
sorry, DAM class is decision making, assertiveness, mission analysis, communication, leadership, adaptability, flexibility, and situational awareness. So we often have training on CRM, also known as DAM class. Those are the components of crew resource management. And we do things ahead of time to prepare for those. So, for instance, we'll have a tactical decision game. So, you talk about a scenario and what would you do in this scenario? A lot of times we will have a debriefing. So if there was an accident, an aircraft accident, we call that a mishap. So there'll be a mishap investigation. And from that mishap investigation, they will determine what were some of the causal factors for this accident. And so we'll sit around our ready room. That's essentially a conference room for pilots, is a ready room. So we'll sit around the ready room and we will talk about the accident and what was learned from it, and we will identify what were some of the things that they could have done differently. What happened the day before? Were they having personal problems? Were there problems within the cockpit? So we have a lot of this training. The other thing we do, whether it's in training or in combat, is we do a lot of briefing. We brief about everything. We brief, we brief, we brief.
So
And what
give us an example of that, of what that would look like. What would be the briefing?
So you'll start off with the situation. So what is the tactical situation or what is the training situation? And then you will go through each and every step. So you have a pre-flight component. This is when we're going to pre-flight. This is how much time you have to pre-flight. And then you'll go into the mission, and you will, as the person leading the flight, I will have done a ton of research. I will have researched the terrain. I will have researched the light level if we're doing it at night. I will have researched the shadows that would be cast on our route of flight if the flight is at night. I would have researched the enemy situation, the capabilities of the different enemy weapons that we might be going up against. I would have uh, talked to the personnel on the ground, because normally with the Cobra, it's a close air support platform. So what that means is that we are directly supporting Marines on the ground in close proximity. So I would have talked to the Marines on the ground. We would have gotten a signals plan. We would have gotten their movement plan. So they're going to go from here, from building A to building B. And then once they're done with building B, they're going to go from building B to building C. You would talk about things like how you would number the windows so that if they need us to shoot a missile into the building, we would know exactly what window they would want us to shoot the missile into, because we've already predetermined what the configuration is numerically of that building. So every window is going to be labeled, every building is going to be labeled. There is a system designed for the streets. So all the streets are named if you're looking at an urban area, for instance. So we know exactly where they're going to be, what their movement is, how we get in contact with them, what is their call sign, what happens if we can't talk to them. We would tell them how much time we can stay in their area. So that's called time on station. So we look at all of those components. We look at how long the flight's going to be. So we talk about mission components, and then we talk about components with the other aircraft. How are we going to talk to the other aircraft? What happens if we can't talk to the other aircraft? And there's a variety of different things you talk about for that.
So you guys spend a tremendous amount of time in preparation and analysis and what if and all of that kind of stuff. How does that translate into a business setting?
I think that can apply to a business setting as well. I mean, you need to understand who your clients are. What are you as a company trying to accomplish? You need to understand the environment that you're operating in, and that's either going to be your competitors or your market, the people that you're trying to serve. So whatever your whatever issue or whatever client population you're trying to address, you need to understand how they operate. You need to understand what their strengths are. You need to understand what their weaknesses are. And most importantly, you need to understand how you can help them. So I think that translates directly to the business world.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of direct correlations between the two in the preparation, understanding, planning for eventualities. Lots of practice. Lots of practice.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure. So I want to just touch on. So I'm sure we could do an hour and go through this whole anagram that you told us, the damn class. But the C you said was communication.
Yes, communication.
So talk us through some of the stuff that you guys do from a communication standpoint.
So there are a number of ways that you can talk about that. There is the actual means of communication. How are you going to communicate? Are you going to go via telephone? Are you going to via radio? I mean, however you're going to communicate. But most specifically, what that is, one of the things that is talking about is your communication within a cockpit. So interestingly enough, like we talked about earlier, there can be a disparity in between the players in the aircraft. One might be more experienced. One might be having a terrible day. One might be a jerk. So you have to be able to communicate with one another, and you have to be able to communicate clearly. Communication isn't just about talking. It's not just about making noise. It's about sending and receiving information. Am I sending the information that my co-pilot needs to know in the time that they need to know it to make an accurate, informed decision? And am I receiving the information I need in a way that I can understand so that I can do what that person needs me to do in a timely fashion? So I think that.
So you're trying to do all this in a stressful situation and
Right.
environment of
Right.
not only preserving your own lives, but those of the troops on the ground that you're supporting and enemies and all of this kind of stuff coming at you.
Right.
If the person that you're in the cockpit with is, as you mentioned, is potentially a jerk or maybe just has a different communication style, how do you fix that?
Sometimes you don't. And ideally you know ahead of time if that's going to be a problem. And
Okay.
as I talked about before, this crew resource management, there are ways inside of the aviation community where if two people cannot communicate, they don't fly together. And there are
Sure.
two ways that happens. Either someone else tells you you're not flying together, or you say, I'm not flying with this person. So I think that that's one way. On the positive side, most of the time that can get talked through. One really good way is during the brief. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a very extensive briefing process. And I think I did the math once, and it was about 4 hours of planning for every hour of flying. So
Wow.
you will have a very detailed plan. After you present that very detailed plan to the crew that you're flying with, then that crew has an opportunity to ask questions. And we often fly in what's called a section, so 2 airplanes, which means 2 airplanes, 4 pilots. And so any one of those other 3 pilots can ask a question about the plan. So before you ever go and embark on your mission, if it's a training mission or a real mission, you know what the plan is, you know the variety of different things that you can expect. And one thing that we always would do is you would have 3 scenarios, 3 essentially what if scenarios. If you lose communication, if you go into bad weather, if you run out of ammunition. And then what will you do in those 3 worst case scenarios? And so you talk through all of that. So that's one way that you can mitigate maybe some different styles in communication, is that you can have a good idea of the plan before you ever step out the door. The other thing is, and I think this is very unique to the military because I found this a little bit more difficult to work with in the civilian world, is there is somebody that is always in charge, always.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is you do what that person tells you, unless that person is going to get you killed. Really, like literally, that's it. If they're going to do something that is, maybe they can't see it, maybe they just don't know. That's really the only time you don't do what they tell you to. Otherwise, that person's in charge. Period. If they sign for the aircraft, they're in charge. Now, there's a few cases where that could get, somebody could override that. Like if I'm flying with my commanding officer and I, for whatever reason, signed for the airplane, but he tells me to do something, I'm going to do what he tells me to because he really is my boss.
Sure.
Like, he signed the flight schedule. So if he tells me no, then no. Obviously, there's
Right.
some good sense that goes on in there. I'll give you a good example. When I was a very young pilot in my first squadron, I had gone out flying at night, very dark night, in a very dark place with a very senior pilot. And we were flying, and I very quickly took the controls and moved the aircraft out of the piece of sky it was in. And he yelled at me at first. I didn't have time to explain, but a few seconds later, he saw the other aircraft go buzzing by. I was in the front seat. You can see much better from the front seat of a Cobra than the back seat. So I had moved us out of the way because I could see that we were going to run into the other aircraft. He couldn't see that. It was very dark. So that's one of the few times when I just did something without asking because, I wanted to live that night.
Right.
But generally speaking, and I think that is probably one area where the business community or the non-military community could take something away from the military, is that someone's got to be in charge. They really do. To have things run smoothly, and that person who is in charge has to understand that there is, like I said earlier, a weight to that, and that is not something that should be taken lightly.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier with, signing for the helicopter, and I kind of made the joke of, it's like a rental car on a business trip. Somebody's got to put down their credit card. But there's obviously consequences in signing for the helicopter, or potential consequences. In the business world, are there those same types of consequences if you're responsible for something?
I think so. I think that if people don't realize how much they impact others and how much their decisions impact others, their companies, it can reflect in the operation of their companies. And the ones that do recognize that, and the ones that do recognize that they have trained their people well and they trust their people, I think those companies do better. I think it's very hard to get people or organizations to change. And this world changes very quickly. I mean, look at the last month, right? The streets are empty. People are having to do everything virtual. If you can't adjust quickly in today's world, you're going to find that it's going to be very difficult to catch up. And so
Sure.
I think it does apply in the business world. And I think that sometimes people simply don't realize, even as a CEO, that that they're in charge. And some that do realize that they're in charge don't realize that maybe they should listen a little bit more to their people than they do.
So let's look at this from another angle for a second. I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because you didn't say this, but I think the military seems to be very bureaucratic, and there's a lot of rules and regulations, and this is the way we do things. Because is that accurate from an outsider's point of view?
I would say yes and no. And I think it, to some degree, depends on the service. I was in
Okay.
the Marine Corps, and I think the Marine Corps, yes, to some degree, there's a lot of this is what we do and this is why. And I think part of that is because you're part of an organization. You're not a person anymore. I mean, you are a person, of course, but there's a solidarity that this is the way we do things, and we do them better than everyone else because we're Marines, and that's just what we do. And if you didn't want to do that, then you shouldn't be a Marine. And I think
Right.
too, another, particularly with the Marine Corps, but I think in every other service has this as well, is that it's not about you. It's about the service. It's about serving the country. And you do have to, I don't think people realize how much you give up to do that. I don't think they realize how much of your own personal freedoms that you willingly give up to do that. And so I think that you have to maintain those standards because there's a job to do. And so whether it's the way you wear your uniform, the way you make sure that you are respectful of the chain of command. You have to do those things to have what we call good order and discipline. Because if you didn't, then people would just do whatever they want. But you can't, because how you train in peace is how you fight in war. And if you're not training the way you're fighting, you're going to lose. And Marines don't lose. So
And I guess that's very similar to any job, really. I mean, you're going to have, the way that we do things. You have your mission statement. Hopefully, as a company, you have a mission statement and say, this is what we're going to do. This is why we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to get there. And you're going to have a dress code so people don't come in wearing, whatever inappropriate stuff to work.
right,
So it's similar to the business. It's just obviously not nearly as stringent,
right,
nor as life and death
right.
as being a Marine.
Agreed.
But in that type of environment, and from some of our conversations, I can tell that you're very out of the box thinker. How do you navigate that environment of this is who we are, this is what we're doing, when maybe there is a better way to do something? I mean, do you just kind of stuff that down and say, I'll save this for later? Or is there a process for speaking up and suggesting something? What does that look like?
So there definitely is a process. And what you're getting after is what we call in the Marine Corps commander's intent. Actually, it's not just the Marine Corps, the services all use that. It's the commander's intent. For instance, I need you to paint the wall blue. Go paint the wall. I don't care if you paint it from top to bottom. I don't care if you paint it from left to right. I don't care if you paint it first thing in the morning or last thing of the day. Just paint the wall blue. Um, so one thing that is unique, I think, probably among the services is that the Marine Corps really prides itself on having people who are innovative in what we call small unit leadership, meaning that you have a corporal who's been in the Marine Corps for 2.5 years. You have a captain who's been in the Marine Corps for 4 years. They have great ideas. It's not just the colonel who's been in for 20. These young folks, they have good ideas too, and so it's your job to tell them what you need at the end of the day, what you need it to look like. Do you need a PowerPoint presentation on, what's going on in Central Asia? Do you need a physical fitness plan to get young Marines who might be overweight to get them not overweight? Do you need whatever it is that you need, the products that you need, and then you let them figure out how to get there. And you're going to have to guide them a little bit. You might say, that probably isn't going to work because that person is probably going to have heat stroke because it's supposed to be 100 degrees today. So that might not be the best option. Or there may be regulations that they have not considered. We did a lot of international flying. So if I let somebody else do the flight planning, they may not have considered these international regulations or these restrictions or something like that. And so I guide that person to make sure that they're within the rules and within the boundaries and within whatever constraints that I gave them or that they needed to consider. But I found that the best leaders let people do that. And in that, you make mistakes. And every once in a while, they would make a mistake. I let them make the mistake, and then they would learn that that wasn't such a great idea, and that there was always a reason why I had done things the way I had, not because it was the way I had done it, but was because the way that worked the best. So they learned that, yeah, maybe that way does work the best, but sometimes their way worked the best. So you really just give them the space to be inventive and use their skills to get where you need to go.
Being able to do that, to give your troops, your staff, whoever it is, the authority to go out and accomplish a mission like painting the wall, however you want to paint it, just make it blue. That requires a tremendous sense of, I guess, security. A sense of, I don't care how it gets done, and it doesn't matter if it's the right way or the wrong way, as long as it gets done. How does that line up with, a mission when lives are at stake?
I mean, I think that it's the same concept. Full disclosure, I did not fly combat missions in a Cobra. That's a story for another day. I did fly the King Air in Afghanistan, a designated combat zone. The King Air is a transport, not a close air support aircraft, so there are different dangers and considerations. But I do think it remains the same. I mean, and when it comes to those kinds of things, when you're starting to talk about real world stuff, the training hat is off and the real world hat is on. And even then, the most experienced pilots, the most experienced people still make mistakes. There are a number of accidents that happened by senior people. They thought that they could bend the aircraft limitations because they knew how well the aircraft flew, and they found out they were wrong, and they crashed the
Hmm.
airplane.
Right.
And sometimes, especially in combat, bad things happen. Airplanes get shot down. That's just the cost of doing business, honestly. And every time you take off, you know that you might not come back. It happens in training too. One of my good friends and an instructor pilot, when I went back for a second, when I came back to the fleet from not having flown for a while, he was an instructor pilot, and we flew some flights together. I had gone to see him one day just to say, hey, thanks. It was great to fly with you. Great to see you. The next day, his aircraft um, had a bird strike. A 5-6 pound red tail hawk hit the aircraft and it crashed, and they both died.
Wow.
There
Wow.
was nothing he could do about that. He didn't do anything wrong. It just happens. It's a dangerous job. At the end of the day, the military is a dangerous job. Flying is a dangerous job,
Hmm.
and that's why you really have to make sure that your people are trained. And when they've met the standard, you let them you let them spread their wings, so to speak. Um,
Literally and figuratively.
Literally and figuratively, yeah. And it really is amazing. I think the people who were uncomfortable with that were the ones that stopped flying. I did know some pilots who were like, I just can't do this. I can't. I knew pilots that were told they were done flying,
Hmm.
because they did not discern that well enough on their own, and they were just never going to get there. um, so I do think there is a component of and you take a risk. It's called a calculated risk. Is this,
Yep.
do I believe more than I don't that this person can sign for this aircraft and take that aircraft and their crew and go do this mission and come back safely? And that's why, when you get to the real deal, when you get to combat, or when you get to the biggest briefing of your business, or when you're briefing your most valued client, or you're briefing your biggest client, or you're doing whatever it is that you're doing that is really hard, you put your best people up there. You put your best foot forward, and that's okay, and that's smart, and that's good. But I think that's the way that concept transfers.
So, in looking at the current business environment, and this is, I don't mean to make this comparison because the two are not the same, but in looking at the current business environment, it would appear, or you could make a statement, and again, this is a horrible statement, but you can make a statement that businesses are under attack and that, businesses are at war, so to speak. Not really, obviously, because war is much worse and combat is much worse. But what are some of the things that you see that is happening today that you can draw of, from your time in the military to help businesses today?
So I think one thing that I have found about the Marine Corps, and I think one thing that differentiates the military from business, is that the military is very much a service organization. And while there's obviously a structure, and while the people at the top of the structure get paid more than the people at the bottom of the structure, I think that there is much more a sense of corporate responsibility, meaning that, for instance, when when you're in the field, when you're doing an exercise, or you have any kind of meal, whether it's for the birthday ball that you're celebrating, or, like I said, a training exercise in the field, the youngest, most junior person eats first. The senior officers do not eat until everyone else eats.
Hmm.
The little guy goes first, and
Leaders eat last.
the leaders eat last. And I think that if the business world could operate more like that, and they would have more, there would be less friction overall, because there wouldn't be this competition between essentially the leaders and the workers, right? Which causes a lot of political and business friction, right? Because the people that that need some stability the most aren't getting it, and there's always that friction. Um, and so I think that having a little bit more of a service mindset, I think, would help businesses. Obviously, businesses need to make money, but if businesses have people that feel valued, those people are going to stick around. Those people are going to stay. I read an article
Sure.
not that long ago that says it costs about $30,000 to replace an employee, and this is in the healthcare field, in the behavioral healthcare field. I don't know that necessarily transfers exactly over to to other business models. Although I would suspect that any long-term business, whether it's real estate or finance, everyone has to get trained. There's clients that you lose when you have some turnover. So whether it's
Sure.
30,000 or 20,000 or 40,000, I mean, 30,000 is probably a reasonable figure for most, for many business models. Um, that if you can keep those people, if you can show those people that you care about them, and that and not just say it, but by doing it, if you can show them that, they're going to stick around, and you're going to lose less money by having that turnover, than by just making more money. So I think that that's one way that businesses could prosper a little bit more in the environment that we're currently in.
And just sort of reinvesting in their people and spending more time with their people.
Yes.
So, Aaron, making the jump from the military, from the Marines specifically, into healthcare, mental healthcare consulting seems a bit of a seems like there's a bit of a gap in there, because I don't know that the Marines are the most touchy feely group of people in the world, and mental health
That's fair.
has has sort of that sense of being sort of a touchy feely kind of thing. Is so what does that look like? What are you doing now? How do you apply this stuff to what you're doing today?
Sure. So, interestingly enough, many of the physical healthcare advances have been made because of the military. And I would argue that many of the mental health care advances have also been made because of the military. And a lot of that revolves around PTSD and people coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, and now even folks coming back, that came back from Vietnam, being able to get the mental health care that they need.
Hmm.
It was a big deal. I knew quite a few people while I was active duty that had some serious mental health issues. As it turns out, I ended up having my own mental health care issues. Had some PTSD to deal with. That I've been really fortunate to have a wonderful VA here in Springfield, Missouri, and a wonderful group that I have gone through treatment with, and they've become like my second family. So I'm thrilled that I had that opportunity. So I was introduced to mental health care from the military, but also on a personal level. My brother is seriously mentally ill. He is bipolar with schizoid affective disorder, and he has had that his entire adult life. He's been in and out of facilities. He is currently in a long-term behavioral health care unit. And because of my brother, my younger sister has always devoted herself to mental health care. She got her master's in public health and worked with many national healthcare, mental health care providers. So the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, the National Council for Behavioral Health Care. So she worked for them for many, many years. And then 3 years ago, she stepped out on her own to start her own company and start helping behavioral health care companies basically do their jobs a little bit, be able to do what they love, but do it better, to be able to help people more, to be able to help to be able to help their executive leadership teams operate at peak performance. We have a lot of really unique connection points to the network of behavioral healthcare experts and early adopters, because she has been in the healthcare field for so long, and the two other women that we work with, they've also been in the healthcare field, behavioral healthcare, for a very long time. And so between the four of us, we're passionate about fostering joy and happiness among our client organizations to help them improve the well-being of the families and the patients that they serve, as well as the people that work in their organizations. So our approach is always people first. But it ended up being a really good place to land because I bring that strategic planning perspective. I bring the ability to operationalize a plan for, even though behavioral health care and mental health is very touchy feely, and it is, um, these businesses, these organizations, these coalitions still need to have a plan. They need to have a
Sure.
plan to be able to get grant money and enhance their ability to serve clients, whether it's with addictions or with, because there's a lot going on with addiction right now, substance use disorders and things like that, particularly in rural areas. Whether it's that, or whether it's just helping optimize the operations of any particular organization. We want to be able to help them increase their organizational capacity, increase the time they have to doing what they love more. And so those are some of the things that we bring to the table, and a place that I fit in really well, because that detailed planning, that long range look is something that, and then that coaching, that leadership executive coaching, is something that I do very well.
Well, it certainly sounds like it from all the experience that you've had, the 21 years and the 4 hours of planning for every hour of flight. That's a tremendous amount of planning and it's a tremendous amount of experience. Obviously, you bring a lot to the table for your clients. Are your clients, or do you get a sense that there is an uptick in behavioral health need? Because I know there's been a lot of stigma around it, and there is a lot of stigma around mental health, and maybe that's not for me, it's for quote crazy people or whatever. Have you from through your clients, have you heard of an increase in people wanting help or seeking help as a result of the confinement and coronavirus and all that?
So I think overall there is, I mean, I think there is definitely a need for behavioral health care. And I think that, all of the clients we talk to, they never have enough clinicians to serve their clients. That's
Hmm.
something, they don't get paid very well. It's a really hard job. Um, the client populations, a lot of the client populations that they deal with, don't have a lot of money, maybe don't have stable housing, things like that. Now, obviously, it's even worse. And I do know that they've, I was reading an article today about how telehealth, you and I talked about this earlier, but about how telehealth is becoming more prevalent, because right now that's really the way that people can communicate. It's the way people can get help. So that is increasing in prevalence. And one thing that's interesting about that is seeing behind the scenes on some of this. Whenever a regulation gets changed, there's the whole backside of the data network that has to change. When the rules change, the codes change and the times change and the hours change and the amounts change. And it's a huge upheaval for these organizations that have to institute all these changes. And because everything is so data driven, that can be very, very time intensive for folks who are not data people, they're clinicians. And so it takes even more time. And that really levies a price on them as far as their ability to kind of get things done in a timely manner. And these are all really devoted people. They're very passionate people. So we really want to help connect them to people that can streamline those operations.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and your insights, in leadership and preparation and practice. I think there's a lot of really great information here that applies to all businesses across all industries.
Great. Thank you. It was really wonderful. And I enjoyed this conversation a great deal.
Hopefully, you found something helpful or insightful in today's episode. If so, I'd ask you if you could please leave a comment or like on Facebook or rate us wherever you may be listening. That would really help me out, and it would help other people like yourself find the show and find these episodes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
This was the Philip Gagnon Show. Be sure to visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Philip Gagnon Show and join in on the conversation. Access the show notes and discover some fantastic bonus content. The Philip Gagnon Show.